Yes, thank you, everyone. Dr. Rashid, I just want to say that was a very enlightening session, and thank you very much for that. We'll now go on to this session of continuing on the subject of resistance. We will be hearing from Gabriel Greaves, who is he is a professor at Kennesaw State University. He was the Programs and Partnerships Coordinator for the Prince George's African American Museum and Cultural Center from 2019 to 2022. He is a historian and educator. He's also an interdisciplinary researcher who has worked on community outreach and grassroots organizing for the past 14 years. He has a KSU Masters of American Studies with a background in Afro-Latino studies. He is also of Afro-Caribbean descent, specifically from Maroons in Jamaica and Bajan. He has led several education panels on Afro-Indigenous cultures with the Prince George's County schools and also with entities in Georgia and other places as well. So I introduce Professor Gabriel Greaves, and we did get a bit of this a bit of insights about Black Seminoles in the last symposium as well. So I think what this session does is really take us from the Sierra Leone context and take us into the larger global context of the One Journey. So Gabriel, on to you.
Awesome, cool. Can everyone hear me? Can everyone hear me today?
Yes.
Okay, stellar. Well, it's a privilege to be here today, and I'm so thankful for the opportunity to share with you all in regards to the history of the Black Seminoles, and more specifically, how it ties in with the story of Freetown. So let me go ahead and start off by saying, as a heads up, I had a lot more things to present for everyone in regards to a PowerPoint, but my computer had crashed on me. And so thank goodness for the awesome work and help of other brothers like those who are on this call. I have several book resources, and I want to make certain that you guys get that. And so in place of some of the things I want to show you via PowerPoint, I'm going to take you through an audio presentation and a visual presentation via showcasing several books that will help you out. So let me go ahead and do some things. Number one, let me show you this one book that will be the most powerful book you can have in your arsenal for understanding where we're going today. This book is called Freedom on the Borders, the Seminole Maroons in Florida, the Indian Territory, and Texas. This book by the late Dr. Kevin Mulroy deals extensively with the stories of the Black Seminoles. One of my elders, who I would suggest everyone look into, Brother Phil Fixico, he is a descendant from the Seminole Maroons, the Seminole experience, and he's actually cited in this book. He was a part of the 2009 symposium called, I believe, it was called Indivisible Native and African American Lives, Native African American Lives in the Americas. The symposium itself dealt with the lives of those who are Afro-Indigenous and how their stories have been repeatedly left out. I want to again show this book. Can everyone see this book right here? Can you see that now?
Yes.
Okay, so the reverse button. So this book right here, again, Freedom on the Borders. Everyone get this book, please. Freedom on the Borders by Kevin Mulroy. It deals specifically with the story of the Maroons, which is not talked about enough. When it comes to Indigenous culture and heritage, many are of the understanding that to be Indigenous means that you center the tribes of North America. What they're not aware of is how many times Native Americans and African Americans intersected to have a completely unique experience. And again, as mentioned before, one of my elders was referenced in this particular book because he was interviewed to share his story. This story ties in with those who were enslaved, not just from the slave trade that took people from Sierra Leone to Barbados, but took people from the same spaces all the way to Carolina, and then from the Carolinas all the way out into Florida territory as well. If you look up people in the Seminole history, some of the names that you should find out are individuals such as John Horse. I believe John Horse is on the left side of the screen. Yes, I can see him clearly. Thank you. John Horse led a band of African and Afro-Native runaways, and he had an alliance with the Seminole Indians. He also worked with others who were prominent leaders in the Maroon experience, such as Wildcat. And eventually they migrated from the Indian territory to places like northern Mexico in the mid-19th century to escape from slavery. And other Maroons joined in subsequently to help soldiers in Mexico when it came to their frontier defense and when it came to the liberation movements that happened. Cinco de Mayo just happened recently. And what many are not aware of as a point of historical fact is that that story ties in directly with the Cimarron experience, because the Cimarrons also went into Mexico. And at one point, when the battle for Mexican independence took place, the majority of soldiers that were used for that battle came from the Maroons themselves. The Maroons were the frontline soldiers in that war. Did everyone hear what I just said?
I did.
Stellar, stellar. I can't mention that point enough, because how many, I'm just getting a guesstimate here, how many have heard of Cinco de Mayo? I'm assuming many here have heard of that, but how many have heard of Cinco de Mayo's connection to the Maroons? And for that matter, the Afro-Mexicans, who themselves have ties to the Maroons, and for others going all the way back to Freetown. You don't really hear about that story, but that story is left out on purpose because of the anti-Blackness that surrounds many countries and many nations across North America, South America, and Central America. And so it's really critical to make certain that you have receipts. And this book, again, is one of the most powerful receipts you can have on the story of the Seminole Maroons. So one thing I want to make clear when it comes to the Seminole Maroon experience is that many of the Seminoles have taken time to let people know that they were not always known as the Seminole Nation. As I was told by several elders, specifically with the Seminoles, at one point they had a confederation of independent towns. And these towns, you know, were scattered across Florida. Others who were outsiders, specifically from the, be it the British or the American Patriots, they would try to classify all the different towns under one label, Seminole. And at one point, the Seminoles had to just kind of say, you know what, fine, we're going to be called the Seminole Nation. But originally, it was a conglomeration of multiple towns. You can see here on the following map from the book that was referenced earlier, I believe. Another book that I want you to have is called the Seminole Maroon. The same elder that I referenced, Fixico, is actually referenced in that book as well. This map shows the different towns that were a part of Florida at the time. You can see, of course, the different town, their names, and more specifically, what the locations were. But what's not talked about is the amount of African Americans and Afro-Caribbeans who were in those various towns. When the slave trade happened, many tapped into the Underground Railroad and found freedom going up north. What's not talked about is how different things were in Spanish Florida. Because in Spanish Florida, slavery was abolished far earlier. And as a point of contention, the American Patriots wanted to expand slavery into Florida. And so Florida became a hub of resistance for those who were of African and Afro-Caribbean descent. Many are aware of the Underground Railroad and how the Underground Railroad went up north. But what many are not aware of, unfortunately, is how the Underground Railroad went south. If you look up something specifically called the Saltwater Railroad, you'll find more information that pertains to this. They have an entire tour that you can go on should you go to Florida. And in this tour, if you look up Saltwater Underground Railroad, they have a space on Facebook as well as another website you can check out. But if you look them up, they have an audio tour that will take you to multiple spots that were tied to the Saltwater Railroad and the experience of the Seminoles and the Black Seminoles and the Maroons. The reason why this is important is because, again, the Underground Railroad did not just go north, and many of the Seminole towns welcomed runaway enslaved Afro-Caribbean, African Americans, and many also fled to Florida from the Caribbean as well. This is why it was such a threat for the United States when it came to others such as John Quincy Adams, later describing the Seminole Wars as a Negro War. That is not something that you would hear in many classrooms, unfortunately, today. But the Seminole Wars, while in popular narratives have been portrayed to be exclusively for North American indigenous communities, they were also considered by the founding fathers to be a war of runaway enslaved Africans. They called it a Negro War because of how many Seminoles were welcoming people of African descent into their ranks. The other book that you should see on your screen right now, called The Maroons of Prospect Bluff and Their Quest for Freedom in the Atlantic World. This is a critical book that I would highly recommend for everyone to investigate, because it deals with what happened when the Maroons across the Caribbean, including Maroons as far away from Guyana and all the way to Barbados and then Jamaica, several of those Maroon communities fled to Florida, specifically to Fort Negro, I believe near the Appalachian River near Tallahassee, Florida. They fled to that spot called Fort Negro because they saw that in that particular space was freedom and there was unity across the multiple indigenous tribes and African-American runaways. To give you more detail, the book on the right, called The Second Creek War, it follows up with the Creek War. What happened with the Creek War is that at one point, Andrew Jackson made an alliance with a particular brand of Creeks, a particular sect to be more specific. And these Creeks, in order to maintain their holdings on the land, chose to do whatever they could to prove themselves to the Europeans who were enslaving others. They wanted to show that they were civilized. And so these particular Creeks in places like Alabama and Georgia and parts of Florida, they chose to practice slavery. And they were for a time seen as equals, but there was a sect of Creeks who resisted this. And these Creeks were called Red Sticks. They were called Red Sticks due to the fact that they used war clubs that were painted red. They also had another part of their community called the Black Red Sticks. The Black Red Sticks were those who were either formerly enslaved African Americans or Afro-Caribbeans, or those who were both Creek and of Creek and African ancestry. The Black Red Sticks joined forces with the Red Sticks, and they came together specifically to resist their Creek brethren. One thing of note when it comes to the Creeks is that the Creeks themselves also promoted multiracial understandings of their culture. They had several Creeks who were mixed with those of European descent, specifically Scottish and I believe English ancestry. But those Creeks who were primarily mixed with Scottish ancestry chose to side with Andrew Jackson, and the Creeks who were siding with the Creeks who were mixed with African ancestry and other groups resisted that group. And so in the end of the Creek War, the Red Sticks lost, and the Red Sticks and their allies, the Black Sticks, were told to flee to Florida in order to find help from their kin and their brethren in that space as they continued their resistance against U.S. Imperialism and expansion. And that led to the development of the Seminole Wars. Would you go back 2 slides, brother, if you could, please? If you can, that slide. If you zoom in on that slide, go that one right there. It shows, for example, one of the towns in specific, the different spaces that Black Seminoles occupied during the various parts of the Seminole Wars. And these towns, you know, for those who can see on the screen, research these towns in your own time, because many do not realize how much Black history has been a powerful point of Florida's indigenous history. Again, there were a smattering of Black towns that were crisscrossed throughout the upper part of Florida. And when Andrew Jackson chose to fight against the Seminoles, he made a very strong point to not only attack the Seminoles, but to attack and eradicate Black towns that were centered for freedom. Many of those who lived in Florida were Maroon ancestry, obviously, as I said before, but they had never been enslaved. Some Maroons who had fled slavery joined forces with the Maroons who had grown up their entire lives living in the woods, so to speak, living in the bush. And so when Andrew Jackson came to Florida to get rid of the Seminoles, he decided to target Black towns because of the existing racism that was already present against African Americans and those of African descent as a whole. This war, by the way, with the Seminole War, is seen as a continuation of the various slave rebellions. I didn't have time to talk about it in the PowerPoint, but if you study things such as the Haitian Revolution was one of the primary reasons the Seminole Wars bothered white patriots during this era, because when they saw the Seminole Wars, they saw the many coming from Beaufort and Charleston and fleeing from those spaces down into Florida to find refuge. They did not want to have a bastion of refuge being so present in their context as it concerns their expansionist policies. And so again, keep that in mind when it comes to Seminole Wars. Another way to understand this is to see it as a Negro war and as a war where Maroons and various people of African background joint forces, and they joint forces specifically at Fort Negro. Fort Moses was another space that people joint forces with. They also went down to the southern part of Florida near Coral Springs, and they also fled out to Bahamas as well, where they found freedom with the British. There's a particular book that should be in the PowerPoint called Black Seminoles, and I would recommend that book as well for those who do not know about the history. Black Seminoles was written by Dr. Rosalind Howard, and it deals specifically with the fact that Seminoles and their cousins, the Gullah Geechee community, when they fled on the Saltwater Railroad, they joined forces together to make a new people, and many of them fled into Andros Island in Bahamas, and their descendants are still there to this day. In the picture, I believe that's a picture of one of my associates, named is Matthew Griffin. Matthew Griffin himself is a historical reenactor, but he has done presentations for the Black Seminole experience, and he worked with Dr. Rosalind Howard to go to Andros and to visit the Red Bay Seminoles, the descendants of the Seminoles and Gullahs who fled during the Underground Rebel in that spot to make an entirely new community. As a side note, it's really important to keep in mind when it comes to the Seminoles that many of the Seminoles also went to spaces such as Cuba and to spaces like Puerto Rico. These particular Seminoles that went to Cuba and Puerto Rico were known as Spanish Seminoles. And the Spanish Seminoles still have descendants in those spaces today, because again, they were not stuck in one particular area. They were a migratory tribe. The Mississippi were also part of that experience as well. As a fun aside, the Mississippi tribe gained federal recognition in Florida because the US government refused to acknowledge them. And the Mississippi decided to go to Cuba, where Fidel Castro actually gave them acknowledgement and acknowledged the different tribes that fled from Florida into Cuba. And the US, in panic, decided to give federal recognition to the Mississippi tribe. And the Mississippis felt that they were separate from the Seminole people as a whole. This is a little fun aside, just to keep in mind how tribal developments can be shifted by political realities. With the Maroons and the Cimarron experience, many of them found themselves not being able to be acknowledged because of the threat that Africa had in the mind of the US patriots. And that's why there are still battles for those who are part of this story of Cimarron ancestry. Many of the Seminoles who fought alongside the Maroons, while they fought alongside them as allies, there was an uncomfortable alliance because they still felt that they were separate in their origins, having African descent. And so the Cimarrons and the Seminole and the Black Seminoles live within Seminole towns, but even though they lived within the Seminole towns and fought against the U.S., at many points they were not truly seen as brothers in arms, and that was an uncomfortable tension that existed. It wasn't that way for everyone, but it was there nonetheless. And this is why when the Seminole Maroons and the Black Seminoles went out left to Mexico, they ended up breaking away from the 5 civilized tribes, the Seminole Nation, and going even further south. And at one point, John Horse, if you dig into it, there are several resources knowing that John Horse has considered taking the Seminole Maroons with them all the way to Africa. And I believe he was trying to take them back to Sierra Leone at one point and several other spaces. But again, that's something that's not really talked about. And the time I have left, by the way, I want to go ahead and get you some presentation of several other books. If everyone can see my screen, please consider this book right here. If you want to have more in-depth knowledge, it's called Slavery in Florida, Territorial Days to Emancipation. It deals specifically with understanding the Seminole Wars in terms of slave resistance or enslaved resistance. It talks about how those at the vanguard of the Seminole Wars for the Seminole Nation were predominantly of African descent. And they deal specifically with the fact that if you were a part of the Seminole Nation at the time, you weren't just seen as a Seminole based on your bloodline. that was there when it came to matrilineal descent, but it was also about a cultural exchange. Another brother and I were talking about this point not too long ago when we talked about how others may do a DNA test, like an Ancestry.com test or a 23andMe test. And though they may have been told that they had native or indigenous ancestors, their results would show high African heritage, West African heritage in Pacific. And while that is important to know what the indigenous tribes are that they may hail from in Africa, it's also important to know that genetics does not talk about your culture, because there were many of African descent who intermerged with the culture of the Seminoles, just like they did with the Cherokees or with the Seneca and several others, and they were culturally a new people. So keep this in mind when it comes to talking about Afro-Indigenous heritage. It is not solely about bloodlines. It's about cultural experience. It's like having a river where a major river has different tributaries that blend into it to make it impactful. It's the same thing what we're talking about. And again, this book right here, Slavery in Florida, Territorial Days to Emancipation, is a great book. And the last book I want to give you guys, two more books and I will leave you be. Creeks and Seminals. This book, is by Dr. Wright Jr. Really powerful book that deals specifically with the relations that Native Americans and Afro-Americans had in the Americas. Creeks and Seminole. It talks about what happened during Andrew Jackson's time with the Creeks and the Seminoles and Mississippi's, who were the largest group of Indians living on the frontier in Georgia, Alabama, and Florida. This is a great book to check out. Finally, this book right here, I would highly recommend, called Rebels and Runaways, Slave Resistance in 19th Century Florida. It deals specifically with Florida's unique historical significance for runaway slaves. And it talks about the different rebellions that were inspired by the resistance that occurred in Florida and the Seminal Wars, which are also considered the largest resistance of enslaved peoples. There should be one more book in there, I believe, that was mentioned, called Black Spanish Florida. Is that in the slide? I can, Brother Decker, is that in the slide? Thank you. Black Society in Spanish Florida is the final book I want to recommend to everyone. It deals specifically with what I mentioned further with the Red Sticks and in specific regard to the Black Red Sticks and how they joined together and did extensive resistance. Please consider these resources that have been made available. And if anyone has any questions, my email is ggraves, ggreaves103 @comcast.net. And again, I hope it has been a benefit for you all today to understand how triracial communities work and some of the dynamics of the Black Seminole experience as it concerns Freetown. Many of the Maroons who went back to Freetown came from this experience that we're talking about today. When people talk about ancestry and DNA tests, many will be surprised when they do their DNA tests to find they have indigenous ancestry, even though they grew up in West African cultures. And that's because the triracial dynamic impacted them with their ancestors coming from Spanish Florida all the way to Sierra Leone or to Nigeria and a number of other spaces. So keep that in mind when it comes to understanding how these stories play out to embrace all of our roots. That's all I have to say today.
All right, thank you very much, Professor Greaves. Thank you very much for that insight. It's definitely always enlightening for both the first symposium and this second one when we go to, us as, I guess mostly Sierra Leoneans and West Africans in general, when you start expanding the knowledge base into the experience, the broader experience, the broader Black experience. Amadu joined us last symposium with several panelists from the Gullah community. Amadu has been a very ardent promoter and social agitator, I guess, in terms of Sierra Leone and African-American connections for the past, I want to say, 15 maybe years, much of which I've, participated in several ventures with him as well. So I can definitely vouch for his passion and knowledge in this area. So Amadu, on to you.
Thank you, Akindele. How's everyone doing today? I'm Amadu Massally, and I'm in Dallas, Texas, Sierra Leonean born and bred. I have to talk about resistance today, and hopefully, when we're done, you'll be more familiar with a special place in Sierra Leone that even Sierra Leoneans don't know much about until we, quote unquote, exposed it a couple of years ago in a big way. With that said, we have an introductory video that I wanted to share about our trip to Oliagala a few years ago that culminated into a documentary film called Gola Roots. So Adrian, if you can help us in showing part of that video to set the pace, I would appreciate it. Brilliant.
Today, we're about to go see a place that has not been talked much about at all. In fact, we're going to expose it to the world today, if you will. And it's a place that symbolizes what Africans did to prevent themselves from being taken away by other Africans to the coast, to be sold off to the Americas or anywhere else they were taken to. So we're looking at the resistance aspect of our three elements, which are slavery, resistance, and abolition. We did slavery yesterday. We're doing resistance today by going to show our guests where this place, this village was built up on the flat top, a mesa, where Africans can see 10, 20 miles away people that will be coming to invade them, looking for, to capture them as slaves. So, because that stuff has not been talked much about, we want the world to know that Africans had institutional resistance to the slave trade. And Oliagala exemplifies that better than anything we know. So world, get ready. We're about to show you some stuff you've never heard about. And you'll feel proud as Africans in the diaspora that our people did not just give themselves up freely, but we fought, we resisted, and we did what we can do in terms of preventing the slave trade from impacting our people.
Just like any other country, Sierra Leone has its roots, the name, the land. So we had Pedro da Sintra. He was a Portuguese explorer. He was using the Atlantic Ocean, and as a result of the shape of the city, where it looks like Lion Mountains, then he named the country Sierra Leone, which means Lion Mountain in Portuguese. Yeah, it's not that it is not that he founded Sierra Leone, because there were many people around. We had the Limbas, the Kurankos, we have the Mendes, we have the Timnis. There are many people around the city. But he saw the shape of a lion, and he called the country Sierra Leone, which means Lion Mountain in Portuguese. So that is how we got the name.
This is a source of water for our ancestors who were staying up the hill. And well, women will prefer to be beaten than after they have taken the water up there and then you throw it away. They prefer being beaten because it's very strenuous to climb. We will see.
Yeah, we already see. So remember that women who always fetch water most of the time in African countries, I don't know why, but they feel the brunt of fetching water down here and taking it back up to the top. Yeah. And like he said, they would prefer to be beaten rather than come down here and fetch water.
Well, yeah, we were on our way to Oliagala. The young man that you saw on the bus talking about Sierra Leone was one of the chaperones, if you will. We refer to them as Bonds Island warriors. But let me talk a little bit about the place itself. I mean, this is a special place for African pride in Africa. According to archaeologists, in fact, Iagala Old Town, which is a formal name, it's an initial occupation late in the first millennium. And then it was later followed by an 18th to 19th century type of occupation, which is clearly associated with the Limba people, as Dr. Rashid mentioned earlier. Again, according to research done by scholars touching on these historical data and oral traditions, there are some known history regarding its being a defensive strategy against human invaders. However, much was not done in 1879 when the first two scholars went up there. They basically described the town and they didn't pay attention to the archaeological aspects of what this place was until world-renowned archaeologist Chris DeCourse, some of you may know his name, he went up there and did some archaeological work that shed more light on what this special place used to be. So, according to him, it is one of the most striking of Limba towns, Limba fortified towns. There are a few up there, some of the Yalunkas also. For example, I know of a place in those same Warrior Mountains where Africans built cotton trees as fence, yeah? They locked themselves in, having these massive cotton trees around their village. But this place was special because it had it was granite, right? So you couldn't really bury sticks and build huts. So what they had to do was use rocks, stones, and mud against boulders. As you would see, Adrian, can you show the picture of the the link of the photos that we have? Big boulders that have these huts built around. So I was waiting for Adrian to show the photos of some of these boulders and the remnants of what's left of this special place. Can you do that for us, Adrian?
Share my screen. Okay.
Okay, Aminata, you can share yours too if you have that, yeah. So you see the boulders there and the fact that it was a mesa where you could see 10 to 20 miles away and you can protect yourself from slave invaders who were unfortunately other Africans coming to get these Limba guys. When we were up there, we saw for ourselves what a special place it was, because you could just feel, I don't know, I experienced some, spirituality up there. One of the things that we learned whilst we were up there, in fact, you heard the guy mention it earlier, that there were two springs, but you had to walk down the hill to fetch water, and mainly it was being done by women. They still do it when young girls go to fetch water in Africa, many parts of Africa. But the point is, those women would have preferred to be beaten than for them to go down and fetch water, and your husband, for example, as a way of punishment, spills the water. That means they have to go back down, come back up, balancing buckets of water on their head. A tedious task. Even for us climbing up there, it wasn't easy. We were also told about the burial site. 5 chiefs were buried up there, right? So at least they were there for 100, 150 years up at that village. But how they would bury the chiefs, because they couldn't dig large holes, they would bury them on a hammock above a pit. And then when the chiefs would die, they would stay up there until the chief that replaced the dead chief dies. Then, of course, it would be just bones when the successive chief would die, they would go to the hammock, gather all the bones, wrap them up, and put them in the pits, you know, in a closed sort of compartment, if you will. And then the chief that just died would be hung on the hammock, waiting for his successor to die before he'll finally be buried. I think that was really interesting. But they had to do that because they didn't have much space, and they were managing space. We're also told about a spot up there where people in that village who were assigned witchcraft or were identified as a witch, they would throw them off a cliff. So as we were up there, we went to the exact spot where they would throw people off because they were thought to be witches. But they stopped doing that. Let me tell you how or why they stopped. The last person that they threw down, the person who pushed him or her was drawn along. So in other words, you try to push me, I grabbed your hand, and we both fell to our demise. So after that, they stopped doing that practice. They also had 3 different villages up there, even though it's called Old Yagala, there were 3 different villages, we were told. But to wrap it up simply, some Africans from Sierra Leone settled at a place called Yagala, where they showed institutional resistance to the transatlantic slave trade. And that's special because normally when we go to these stores in Sierra Leone, for example, we go to Bonds Island. It is one thing to go to Bonds Island and see a warehouse of humanity and feel the pain and the suffering that goes with all of that. However, it is quite another thing to climb up that mesa and see how our ancestors built homes using African ingenuity to resist the slave trade at a place that lasted, and a place that lasted for decades until 1952, when the settlement was deserted. I wish we were able to see the rest of the video because we went up there. I mean, you could see for yourselves from up there how special the place it would be. It could be. One of the pictures that's on the screen right now is speaking to what's left, the remnants of Old Yagala. But it's actually worse now. This was years ago. I think this was in the 60s when these pictures were taken. And our pictures, those are about maybe a quarter of what's left. So about 1/4 of what you see now is what is left of these historic icons that need to be preserved. So we need preservation for this place, as bad as it is with Old Forobe College and all those other places. Old Yagala needs preservation more than any of them because of the state in which it is in now. And I hope sooner or later, someone will see some sense to make sure we preserve this special place. We don't have too many of them in Africa. We have them, but we don't have enough of them that shows resistance to the slave trade in our own African way. All right, so that's all for now with regard to the slave trade. I think another thing I wanted to talk about a little bit was the Black Seminole story that our friend just spoke about in terms of how we link to all of that. So I do have a map that will help guide me and you guys through the talk. If we can have that on the screen, we would appreciate it. Yes, can you enlarge it? I mean, that's... So basically what we're seeing there is a map that shows the Sierra Leone dollar connection. If you look at the green, well, let's say the red arrow, the thick red arrow that's coming from Africa is going into the Carolinas, yes. South Carolina, later Georgia, 60 years later. Sierra Leonean specifically, because we're pointing from Sierra Leone to South Carolina and Georgia. There are 2 lines, or two different colors of arrows. One's green and one's red. I'll talk quickly about the green one. The green one is the one that deals with Sierra Leoneans going into South Carolina and or Georgia. Some of them were taken to Halifax, Nova Scotia, up north for some years. And then eventually they were brought back down to Sierra Leone as Black loyalists. You all know those stories already. The red line is what we're going to focus on today in terms of the Black Seminoles, who showed their own resistance to the slave trade. This was actually slavery. I think Dr. Rashid mentioned earlier that slavery was not in Africa. They were captured there. Well, slavery was more in the Americas, where our people were put to work against their will and with no pay. So that first red line that shows the curve, or the second one after coming from Africa, the one that shows the curve, it's saying Africans on plantations in South Carolina and Georgia made their way to Florida, Spanish Florida. Florida was owned by the Spanish then. The Spanish king had announced a creed that everyone who makes it to their state, well, it wasn't a state then, who made it to Florida would be free. So Indians, Seminoles, and Africans, these Gullah Geechee people, some of them made their way into this area. And together, they coexisted. They became, the Black guys became Black Seminoles. You would see some of them actually started dressing up like Indians, but also the Indians learned how to eat rice. There were some intermarriages also between these two groups. So they became Black Seminoles, and they resisted the US Army. I think our historian friend, Dr. Greaves, mentioned it earlier, that these guys waged a war against the entire US Army. And well, there were about 3 wars they had there, but the second one was the one that had the black Gullah Geechee descendants or African descendants. So Jessup, the commander of the war, General Jessup, one time is documented in the Library of Congress somewhere, wrote back to Washington, D.C. to make the distinction that they better believe this is not an Indian war, it's a Negro war. So they were, I mean, the first war perhaps was a little easier because it was more Indians. Once those brothers and sisters got to Florida and joined the Seminoles, their resistance was stronger. For 7 years, the US Army couldn't defeat them. And that led to General Jessup sending that statement, this is not an Indian war, but a Negro one. Now, after that, they signed some kind of agreement and they were taken to Oklahoma. So the next arrow that points inland into America, it's pointing to Oklahoma. From Oklahoma, whilst in Oklahoma, they were again raided, this time by other Indians, Creek Indians, Cherokee Indians. Of course, they fought them off. After a while, they got sick and tired of defending themselves against Indians. We hear a group of guys who had resisted the entire US Army, Black Seminoles. And they're not going to be, maltreated by Indians who were not as powerful as the entire US Army. So after doing that for some time, some of them, the John Horse Band, I think our friend mentioned John Horse also, they moved down to Nacimiento, Mexico. That's that arrow going down before it comes back into a loop. So if you go down, that's going across Texas border into Mexico. Stay there for a few years. Again, other Indians try to harass them. They, fend them off. The US, again, the US Texas Rangers went there twice to sort of, capture them. Guess what? Those Black Seminoles sent those Texas Rangers running back into Texas. And not only that, they were so impressed by the Black Seminoles that these Texas Rangers recruited some of them to join their force. And whereas they were there, they performed in they gave stellar performances. 4 of them have the highest medal of honor the US Army can give soldiers. And they currently live in Brackettville, Texas. So that loop that comes back is the last place where where Black Seminoles were identified to be in today. Now, there's another arrow that goes down, further down, and the other way, that right there. And that's identifying those who went to Andros, Bahamas, as Mr. Greaves spoke about earlier also. So the importance to us is that these connections all have Sierra Leonean imprints. In fact, imagine when they were in Mexico, Dr. Hancock had mentioned to me that whilst they were in Mexico, he recorded 10 many words being spoken among Black Seminoles in Mexico before they came back into Bracketville. And part of what we do from Boutique, because I've been to all these places, except for Andros, Bahamas, that's next on a plan. So I've been to all these places, and we go and talk about our Sierra Leonean connections with them. And everywhere I've been, people have been so receptive. Now, sooner or later, we will have a homecoming, a Black Seminole homecoming to Sierra Leone by Fan Boutique. All right, I think I've said enough, and I know we're pressed for time, so I will end here for now. Thank you all for listening, and let's keep on moving.
Thank you very much, Amadu. We have 4 minutes left, and I have to perform a miracle. You've heard about African Americans. You have this connection between the Black Seminoles, Native Indians, the connection. What most of us don't, and then you've heard about the African Americans in the South. I had the pleasure of meeting someone who made a trip just this past week to Sierra Leone, whose history is connected to all those three. And when she did her ancestry genealogy, she found she was from Sierra Leone. So she has roots in the Native American context. She has roots in the American enslavement in the South. She has roots in Sierra Leone, and it was quite a very important trip for her. And I had the pleasure of meeting her. She's on, and she may take a few minutes before she runs off to her 12 to tell her story. Her name is Maleo Vida Woods. Are you on, Vida? I'm going to share the screen so people see who you are. If you're on, please go ahead.
I am on. Thank you, Adrian. I'm just kind of getting ready to prep for the next session that I have with Protect Us Kids. But thank you so much for inviting me. And I'm actually on the whirlwind. Adrian and I got back in yesterday, and this was my first trip to the continent, let alone having an opportunity and being blessed and fortunate to be able to actually stand on the land of my ancestors. And so I'm so thankful, and I really appreciate you all helping me along the way with really just trying to understand my own family journey. Just a little bit about myself. Again, my name is Vida Woods. My family, from what I know verbally, growing up, I grew up on the south side of Chicago, Illinois. My grandfather was born in Grenada, Mississippi, actually Holcomb, Mississippi, the little bitty town next to Grenada. And my grandmother was born in Chicago, but her mother was born in Tennessee. And from what I recall, Chattanooga, Tennessee, to be exact. My grandfather passed away a few years ago, and I've always been interested in our family's genealogy. And he asked me before he passed to continue my passion for understanding our family and being able to kind of open those doors that are really close, because most of the people who had the knowledge and understood, what patterns and who was related to who have since passed away. And so I've taken upon myself to actually do a lot of research. I've leveraged, it started with Ancestry.com, which is really interesting for me, especially since the technology behind that enables you to really connect the dots a lot more easier. And then it went to 23andMe, which is the latest tool that I've been using to kind of unfold where we are right now. So fast forward, my grandfather's, his tree line is directly rooted in Mississippi. For him and his family, what's really interesting is they primarily stayed there, the majority of them, within the Mississippi Delta during the Great Migration. My grandfather, along with many others, migrated up to Chicago looking for more opportunities. But when I look at the ancestral tree on his line, it's very much, they kind of stayed within that area, and it can almost be assumed, as I'm looking through, I'm able to find descendants all the way up to the 1900 census. His mother and her children, and my grandfather wasn't even born yet, but it was about 13 of them. I was able to find some information. I'll stick to my grandfather's side. My grandmother, I don't know about you, but my family is a family of secrets. And so my grandmother didn't really talk too much about her side of the family, but from the information that I was able to gather, and also the fact that there are a few women in the family who have unusual names, to include myself, I was able to find her great grandmother, and that kind of opened some doors on her side. But I'll stick to my grandfather's side of the family. So over the years, I've asked questions of my grandfather, just where he was from. He was able, thankfully, to not suffer any type of dementia or anything like that up till the time he passed away. And he can remember things from his childhood very clearly and vividly. I have video of him sharing, his childhood, his journey as a young man. And it's been very helpful in kind of opening these doors. Well, my grandfather would often state that his mother lived on a reservation. And I kind of took it with a grain of salt. It's my grandfather's story. I didn't think too much about it. But he always stated that she lived on the reservation. And I decided, to kind of keep that as one of many pieces of information in my search. On Ancestry.com, I ran across actually his great grandmother. And I noticed where it said place of birth. I immediately became very excited because it listed her place of birth around 1876 on the Choctaw Reservation in Centersville, Mississippi. And I began to do a little bit more research on the Choctaw Nation as a whole, and understood that their main base was in Oklahoma. And there were a series of Choctaw natives that were within the Mississippi Delta as well. As it may have occurred, the white people that were basically going on their own path to identify whether or not someone was native or not, they looked at them visibly and looked at their physical characteristics, right, wrong, or indifferent, and made a determination for many of them of whether or not they had native blood or not. And for those Choctaw natives that were in Mississippi, they were treated a little bit less than those that were in Oklahoma. But long story shorter, I was able to contact the Oklahoma Historical Society, and I was able to look at the Dawes Roll and locate an identification card that my grandfather's great grandmother was issued. And that identification card, I was able to request records that they had for her. And they were able to send that to me actually right before I had made my trip, my journey to Sierra Leone. And I took a look at the records, and what was interesting to me, and it kind of took me aback because I don't really know what I was expecting to see. But one of it was 3 documents, and one of the documents asked the question, "What is your name?" And she provided her name, Lucinda Jones. They asked her who owned her. And I initially assumed, well, maybe they were talking about her husband, but that quickly wasn't the case because that was the 3rd question. And they asked her who owned her, and she said it was a gentleman by the name of Oliver Thomas. And then they asked her, was she married? And she said yes. And again, this is what's transcribed, so someone transcribed this. And they asked her, was her mother? And she named her mother. They asked who owned her, and she stated Oliver Thomas. They asked if she was married, and she said yes. And then they asked her if, the information she was providing was true, and she said yes. Then there was a second document that showed that she owned 40 acres that was valued at like $186. of course, a lot more back then. And that was documentation that, you know, she, like a deed almost, that she owned that land. But then some years later, there's another document that is very strange to me. It asks her, is this your land? And that you have identified? And she says yes. And then it has this question, can you explain why you erroneously claim this land? And the response that she provided was, she mistakenly, claimed the land, but it should have been in the name of Oliver Thomas or whoever the person was at that time. And long story short, there's a big stamp on the document and it says relinquished. And I just looked at that and I was sharing this with my mom, and my mom, her response would be that that's just the way it was. It really wasn't too much that we could do. And if they said it was theirs, it was theirs. But the fact that they went through this process of documenting this to ensure that this was something to me that was premeditated, to ensure that later on down the line, no one could claim that because, quote unquote, we have it on record. And that really stuck with me. And so I'm still in a journey right now to really understand the Choctaw piece. And from which my grandfather described. I'm assuming that his mom may have been born or raised on the reservation, and she since left that. But the record is with his grandmother, and so I'm still in that journey to try to understand what that looks like. On the other side of the house, again, everything verbal. A few years ago, I had family members tell me that we have family in Ocho Rios, Jamaica. And that's the first I had ever heard of that. And so I was like, okay, how did that happen? How did they end up there? I don't recall anyone saying anyone moved to Jamaica. But through my, journey and visit to Sierra Leone and having the opportunity to actually go on the Bunce Island tour, I learned so much, and it really helped fill in the blanks for me. A lot of questions that my family would not have been able to answer themselves. But I'm able to put the pieces together simply because I had an opportunity, again, to visit Sierra Leone and understand more about our journey. So I had shared this with Adrian. There's so much more. I'm peeling the onion. Like I said, my grandmother's side of the house, hers is a little bit different. There's 3 women in my family that have very unique names. Myself, my grandmother, her name was Vermetta, and my grandmother's grandmother named Parthenia. And so I was able to find her grandmother in Chattanooga, Tennessee, but it's still been a journey. So I just wanted to share that information with you all. The work that you're doing is just outstanding. I feel like I've been given so many gifts and blessings because it just seems, the more I feel like I'm coming into a stumbling block, as I keep pursuing, trying to understand more, those doors have been open. So I thank you all so much for listening, and thank you for the opportunity to share.
Thank you, Vida. And I know you'll be telling the story of your journey to Freetown and your experience at Bunce Island and others at a later time. But I know talking to you, all that was enriching experience and information in your journey around your story and your family's story. And it was a pleasure to just see that firsthand in the last 48 hours when you told it. Thank you again. Thank you for being part of this.